and you don't attend it. Then you find yourself.
Hello, everybody. Welcome in. Welcome in.
You're on Sweden.
Thank you so much for coming to over a night with Frank Pittman, as we do his newest book, The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife. Craig is here. Everyone's excited. I know I am. We had the pleasure of hosting him a couple months ago, and I believe with me and you in the conversation, so that was really nice. So we do have The State You're In. We already have autographed copies, but if you like personalization, just let us know, and we can have try to do that for you. We also have Old Florida and Cattail for purchase as well. So I will read a little bit about Craig's bio, and then I will throw it over to him. Craig Pittman is a native Floridian and an award-winning journalist. He wrote for the Tampa Bay Times for 30 years and now writes for the Florida Phoenix. He is the author of several books, including Old Florida, Cattail, and now The State You're In. He's a co-host of the Welcome to Florida podcast. Pittman was named a Florida literary legend by the Florida Heritage Book Festival in 2020. And so with that being said, I will throw it over to Craig. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Okay, are they far enough away from me I can take my mask off? Okay.
Yes.
Please. I'm fully vaxxed and I've had the booster shot and it's the doctor's ring and all that stuff. So. But I just ate a huge meal of cool beans, so it's possible I'll just be burping the entire day. Anyway, but thanks very much for coming out. Thanks for braving this bitterly cold weather outside. Horrible winter weather outside to come out here and listen to me yak about my favorite state. What I contend should not be called the Sunshine State, because that's misleading. We're not any sunnier than several other states. We should be called the most interesting state, because I think we can back that up. Who do I give the high sign to tell you to change slides? You. There you are. Okay, yes. Thank you for volunteering for this important duty. All right, next slide. So in 2016, I had a book called Oh, Florida that came out. And I was very privileged to get to present it here. I was the first author to present here at Town Reader. And when we sent the proposal around, 15 different publishers said, we don't think people want to read about Florida. We're not interested. And one publisher, thank heaven, said, what a great idea. And it'll come out during a presidential election. And the one time every 4 years, the whole nation gives Florida the side eye. So it came out and it made the New York Times bestseller list. It got rave reviews in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and two things happened. I'm sorry, Nick. Yeah, and it won a Florida Book Award. It won a gold medal from the Florida Book Awards. And two things happened as a result. When I was going around presenting the book, and the first thing that happened was people would listen to me, and then they would come up to me afterwards and tell me their Florida stories.
Yeah.
Some of which I could repeat, some of which I cannot. My favorite one was the one about the couple who discovered their next door neighbor was running an illegal nudist bed and breakfast. And the way they found out was they gave their kids a trampoline for Christmas. The other thing that happened was everybody said, when are you going to write the sequel? We want a sequel. Where's our sequel? We want a sequel to this book. And they, when are you going to write Oh, Florida 2 Electric Boogaloo? And I kept saying, well, I don't feel like I've already said everything I needed to say with this one. I don't really think there's anything to do for a sequel. No, there's been so much more wacky stuff that's happened since then. You should do a sequel. So I went off and wrote another book, Cattail, wrote about Florida Panthers. But the whole time I'm thinking, how can I do a sequel to that? There's no way to do a sequel to that. Well, finally it dawned on me, well, maybe there is a way to do a sequel that's not a sequel, to come up with a sort of a Son of Oh, Florida, where it's not the same thing, but it's kind of along the same lines. So if you read the two books, you'll go, well, these aren't exactly alike. Well, no, they're not. But it's a collection of stories and columns, all of which had sort of a similar goal, which is to celebrate Florida's glorious weirdness in many of its aspects. And so that's what this is. It's a stories and columns I've written over the last 30 years that talk about different aspects of life in Florida where people in Florida will read it and go, oh yeah. And people in other states will go, what? So that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. There are 51 chapters. Some are short, some are long. If I'd been smart, I would have made it 52, so you could read one a week. It would take you through the whole year. I was not thinking. And it's divided into 4 sections. And so let me tell you about some of the sections. But first, a word about this wonderful cover. I just have to tell you about this cover. It's by Andy Marlette, who draws editorial cartoons for the Pensacola News Journal. His dad, Doug Marlette, did the same thing for other newspapers and also drew the Kudzu comic strip. Andy's got a comic strip now that he started called Shrimp and Grits. And I just think it's a wonderful cover. It sort of communicates what the spirit of the book is like. I think the only thing wrong with it was he should have picked a handsomer looking cover model. But I guess he worked with what he had. So the opening is about Florida men and Florida women. And so let me tell you about some of the Florida men that are in this book. One of them, the one in the picture there, is Alligator Ron Bergeron, who was how can I put this? Alligator Ron is a man of many parts. Alligator Ron owns a ranch. He's a champion rodeo guy. He is a developer, a road paver, an advocate for Everglades restoration. And at one point, while he was showing people around his ranch in Hendry County, he saw an alligator in a pond and thought he would show off by wrestling the alligator. So Ron dove in and grabbed hold of the alligator, but the alligator had other ideas. The alligator bit down on his hand and took him to the bottom of the pond and began doing the death roll. Well, Ron knew that was not good, and so Ron, with his free hand, punched the alligator in the face several times and made it let go of him, swam back to the surface. His friends took him to the hospital. He got treated. He kind of mangled a couple of his fingers, but he had a great story, and now he had a nickname. That's how he became Alligator Ron. The problem was that alligators are a protected species in Florida, and so an investigator from the Florida Wildlife Commission came by to talk to him about that and to investigate what is technically known as molesting an alligator. The alligator kind of molested Ron back. And so Ron very freely told him about his experience, showed him his fingers, showed him his medical records, and the investigator wrote the whole report and took it to the Hendry County prosecutors, and they looked at it and said, we're not going to prosecute this. No, you didn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. We're not going to take this to court. Well, shortly thereafter, Alligator Ron got appointed to the State Wildlife Commission. So I believe he's the only Florida politician to be appointed to run the agency that investigated. He hunts pythons too. I just thought I'd mention that. He's in his 70s, but he goes out and hunts pythons with a machete. And when I asked him about that, he said, well, I carry a machete, but I'd rather just grab him with my hands. And then there's a piece in there about Ben Henry Pooley, who was sort of a legendary figure in the Florida Panhandle. Ben Henry was a former county employee. He was hired on a 3-2 vote and fired on a 3-2 vote, and then hired back on a 3-2 vote, and then fired again on a 3-2 vote. So he became known as 3-2 Pooley. But some smart guy got the idea of putting Ben Henry in front of a radio mic and telling him, talk about whatever you want to talk about. And Ben Henry turned into a rural Rush Limbaugh because he knew where all the bodies were buried, and he had fun with it. And so it was appointment listening for the radio listeners in Santa Rosa County. Everybody wanted to hear what he had to say about the gas-guzzling young commissioner from Milton and so forth. That led to 4 different attempts on his life, including one that blew up his trailer. And fortunately for him, most of what got blown up was a coat closet, so that muffled the explosion. But the more famous one is what they call the ketchup murder, where agents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement swooped in and whisked Ben Henry Pooley out into the middle of the woods and put ketchup in his hair and made him lie down on the ground so they could take a Polaroid of him looking like he'd been murdered, and they could show that to the person that hired the hitman, who of course was an undercover FDLE agent. Because one of the rules of life in Florida is that 9 out of 10 times that hitman you hired is an undercover cop. Ask for the union card. Always ask for the union card. So, and they also took his pinky ring because he was one of those rural guys who always wears a pinky ring. So they could prove to the guy yes, we did him in. That's not just ketchup in his ear. So, so I wrote about Ben Henry. I spent some time talking to Ben Henry. The hard part was getting Ben Henry to stop talking. But I also talked to the guy who allegedly had hired all the people and paid for all the people to try and kill him, who turns out to be one of his classmates from Milton High School. They actually played football together. And then I wrote about a guy named Wilbur Snap, who has the unlikely distinction of being the first ballpark organist to ever be ejected because of his song choice. There was a close play at the plate at a Clearwater Phillies game, and the call went against the Clearwater Phillies, and so Wilbur played Three Blind Mice. And the umpire, who I should add was 22 years old, very serious, pointed at Wilbur and then did this. And ejected him from the ballpark and made him famous. This is pre-internet. Otherwise, we'd say he went viral. But he went, whatever was viral back in those days, he went it. He got mentioned on the Today Show. He got written up on the New York Times, you name it. So, I mean, I guess today we just say, oh, snap. But that was the story of Wilbur Snap. All right, and then there were some Florida women that I wrote about. Actually, the opening piece in the book, which I kind of think of as the gateway drug for Florida weirdness, is about how Florida has a mermaid industry. Now, you may know, but do you guys know about the Weeki Wachee Springs State Park? Weeki Wachee Springs employs mermaids, which means we are the only state that have mermaids on the state payroll. We do drug testing and everything. And which has led to some interesting conversations about the use of tax dollars to pay for waterproof lipstick and shell bras. But that turns out to be just sort of the seed for this whole mermaid industry that's going on over the entire state. There are mermaids in Pensacola and mermaids in Fort Lauderdale, Jacksonville. There's even a guy in the Weeki Wachee area who used to be a merman, but now he calls himself the Mer Tailor, and he makes the 60-pound prosthetic tails for women and men who want to be mermaids, and makes quite a good living. He charges like $5,000 per tail. They're all made to your individual specifications. He said his dream job was working at Weeki Wachee Springs, but he had to quit because of what he called mermaid politics, which is not a phrase you hear in any other state. My favorite one of the mermaids that I interviewed is the lady in the red bikini who told me, "I'm 47, thank God water lives." I also wrote about the most tattooed woman alive, and I feel it important to mention that last word, alive. I think that's an important distinction. Guinness Book of World Records declared her to be the most tattooed woman alive, and she found love in a tattoo parlor, of course, of all places. But says, that's not just the only attraction. I just want to make that clear. And then there was a piece about these two women who work in St. Petersburg, and they run a professional dog grooming salon during the week, and then on the weekends they go down to the Everglades and hunt for pythons. Like you do. One of them said, I can sit on a cruise ship when I'm an old lady. Right now I'm having fun. So, there you go. They're fine with snakes. They hate bugs, though. If any bugs get in the car, they said, I want to warn you, if a big bug gets in the car, we're bailing. Get down. Now, there's a section there called Crime Does Not Pay Enough. I used to cover criminal courts for the paper, and it really was a fun job because it's like having tickets to all the best Broadway shows. Some tragedies, some comedies, no musicals, unfortunately, but there's a piece in there about the most outrageous con man I ever heard of. That's him in the picture, Joe Boujon. His list of victims included a judge. He got the judge to perform the marriage ceremony for him and his girlfriend. And what he didn't tell the judge, well, there were three things. One was, he didn't tell him, I'm a fugitive from justice. I'm out on bail and there's a warrant out for me because I skipped bail. He didn't tell him that the check that he used to pay him with not only wasn't drawn on a real account, it wasn't even a real check. He drew it himself. And the third thing he forgot to tell him is, oh, by the way, I'm still married to my first wife. So I'm committing bigamy. There's a piece in there on a pair of twins who both kept getting arrested, and the court system repeatedly got confused about which one was which, because of course they'd say, well, it wasn't me, it was my brother. No, it wasn't me, it was the other guy, the guy who looks like me. And then there's a piece about the Sarasota educator, alas unnamed, who persuaded the FBI to spend 2 months investigating the lyrics to Louie Louie. And because supposedly they were obscene. And he actually provided the FBI with a copy of the dirty lyrics. And so the FBI agent who was investigating sent a copy of the dirty lyrics to J. Edgar Hoover. So yes, J. Edgar Hoover got sent obscene mail by one of his own FBI agents. In the end, the FBI concluded that the song was unintelligible at any speed. Ironically, the one person that did not get interviewed was the lead singer for the Kingsmen. He was not interviewed. If he had been, he could have told them, it sounds like that because I was standing on tiptoe because the microphone was up here. And then there's a section on wildlife called Wild Wild Life. This is one of the most intriguing stories of all right here in this picture. Go ahead. There was this legendary creature in the Panhandle that people called the leopard eagle. People swore it existed, but there was no scientific proof of it. It was supposed to be this long, skinny creature. They called it an eel that had spots on it, had little flippers and little wings attached to his head. Sort of like Captain America's helmet. And people would swear they'd seen it, and other people were like, yeah, right, there's no such thing. These guys found one. They found one for real. They were looking for something else, and they found one. And on their own time, and at their own expense, they did all the steps to write up a real scientific description of this creature, which turns out not to be an eel at all. It's a type of salamander called a siren. They named it the reticulated siren, and the little wings are actually external gills, so it can breathe underwater. And the story has an interesting postscript because in the story, I mentioned that the scientist who found the first one put it in a bucket to keep it alive and then transferred that to a Tupperware container. And shortly after the piece ran, I got a very stern letter from a patent attorney in New York who said, I represent Tupperware. And we want to make sure that it was not some other brand of plastic container that you were referring to, but was really a Tupperware container. We're very jealous about our trademark. And so I wrote him back a letter, not at all tongue-in-cheek, that said, I know Tupperware is based in Florida. There's a museum in Kissimmee where you can go in and burp all the containers. And I would never cast aspersions on a Florida-based product because I love Florida so much. And in fact, I think that you guys are missing a bet. I think your clients are missing out. You should get this scientist to endorse your product to his fellow scientists and say, if you find a mythical creature that turns out to be real, put it in Tupperware, because that's the way to preserve it. They have not taken me up on that. I wrote about the iguanas in South Florida, which are becoming more and more of a presence, shall we say, down there to the point where they frequently pop up in people's toilets. And in fact, recently, this is after the book came out, I read that an iguana trapper said he gets 10 calls a week from Hollywood alone.
Wow.
But people calling and saying, there's an iguana in my toilet, what do I do? Don't flush, that doesn't work. They also fall out of trees when the weather gets cold enough. And you may have heard this story, it's certainly made the rounds. This guy living in the Keys was driving along one day, and it was a cold day, and he saw about 40 iguanas on the side of the road. And he thought, as you would, barbecue. Get the neighborhood, grill them up, on the grill. So he stopped, he ran around, he gathered up all the cold-stemmed iguanas and put them in his car and took off for home, not realizing, oh, I've got the heater on in the car. And of course, once they warmed up, they all revived and began running around inside the car. He drove off the road. The one car crashed. He was not injured, but he was hungry. So the iguanas got away. And then, we have such wonderful wildlife in Florida. We've got, roseate spoonbills, we've got manatees, we've got, leopard eels, quote unquote. But we've also got monkeys. There are at least 3 wild monkey colonies in Florida. The biggest one is in Silver Springs, and it wound up there because the guy who was running the Jungle Cruise in the 1930s thought that he wanted to spice up the tour for his customers, so he brought in 8 rhesus macaques and put them on an island. He did not realize that monkeys can swim. And so now there's about 100 of them in Silver Springs, and the park personnel would like to get rid of them, but they can't because the tourists love them so much. So, and one of those, for whatever reason, wound up being shunned by the rest of the colony and wandered over and became the mystery monkey of Tampa Bay, that you may have heard. The mystery monkey, who actually got profiled in the New York Times. I believe it was 2012. So. Now, there were some historic events that are described in this book. It's not all just fun and games. This one, there's a long obit in there for Snooty the manatee, who was the longest-lived captive manatee. Died at age 69, shortly after his birthday, and was still doing tricks that he had learned as a baby manatee back when Harry Truman was president. There's a piece in there on the first bear hunt in 21 years, and also the last bear hunt, because it was so incredibly unpopular. The Wildlife Commission realized that was a big mistake. They actually, the hunters, killed their quota, their week-long quota, in just 2 days. And some of the dead included mother bears that were still lactating. So they had a serious reconsideration of that. We have not had another one. And there's also a visit to Perdido Key, which is a beach I remember from my youth, shortly before the oil from the BP oil spill showed up there, and writing about sort of saying farewell to this clean beach that I remember. There's some life and death stories in there as well. There's one piece I'm actually kind of proud of about a guy who, the framing device is the Arcadia Rodeo, and specifically a guy who dies every night at the rodeo. They put on a big shootout, and he's one of the bad guys. So the good guys kill him every night. But that's sort of a way to talk about the fact that Arcadia has this real history as a town full of cowboys. That was big in cattle in the 1890s. And in fact, Frederick Remington came to Arcadia to write about and draw the cowboys, and was not impressed. Not at all impressed. And see if this sounds familiar. He referred to them as low-browed cowfolk. And even dissed their cattle. He said the cattle were not fit for a pointer dog to mess on. And yet they were shooting and stabbing each other over the fate of these cattle. I think this is where the Florida man stereotype began. I think he started it. There's a piece on a guy from Pinellas County who had been on death row the longest, and under the law, he certainly belonged there. Interestingly, the son of his victim said he was glad he did not gotten a quick execution, because he wanted him to spend as long as possible thinking about what was going to happen to him at some point. And then there was a piece about a woman who had basically dedicated her life, and it kind of ruined her life, showing up at parole board meetings where the 2 men who killed her father, who was a deaf-mute cemetery worker, they had killed him for like $35. And this was in the days when Florida still had a parole system. You could get sentenced to life, and after 25 years you're eligible for parole. And so after 25 years, she started coming to every single parole hearing that they had, just to make sure that they stayed in. All right, and then the last section is just the state you're in, sort of general weirdness and wackiness in Florida. So there's a piece in there about our Florida place names and how many of them sound like euphemisms for your naughty bits. Don't Okahumpka my Weewa Hitchka. Although my favorite one, and I mentioned this in there, is actually, it's called Taintsville. And it's called that not for the reason you think, but because it taint this town and it taint that town. And then the next one is Interstate 4, and how there's a story that it's haunted. That there are ghosts of an immigrant family that died because of yellow fever, and the priest was not there to give them their last rites because he too died of fever. And so they were buried and unconsecrated. And then the DOT came along and just paved right over their cemetery, paved right over their graves. And so supposedly the ghosts of this immigrant family come back and haunt the people who drive on the road and mess up their cell signal and make their cars malfunction and they run into each other. And my question is, why aren't they haunting the DOT? That's who put the asphalt down. That's who's to blame, not the poor driver. And then there's a piece about, what is it? Oh, yes, the secret love affair that actually preserved the Florida Spring. There was a big wheeler-dealer businessman in St. Petersburg, and he owned lots of property all over the state, and he was having a secret affair with his secretary, who was much more than that. She actually knew as much about the business as he did. And repeatedly, they set the date, and they were going to get married, and then he'd get cold feet, and he'd back out. But one time, he gave her a wedding present in advance, and it was a deed to a Florida spring. And when he died and made her the executor of his estate so that she wound up controlling all this land, she sold a lot of it to the state for preservation, but she kept that spring because it meant so much to her. And her family ran it and preserved it. And so it was all because of that one secret affair that spring did not wind up polluted like an awful lot of the others. The sort of the theme of the book is Florida storytellers and Florida stories there. And so I gave some shout outs to some other Florida writers in the book. There's a profile in there about this gentleman, John D. McDonald. If you guys have read the Travis McGee books or any of his other books, I highly recommend Condominium. And in fact, I'm holding a copy of Condominium on the cover of my book.
Wow.
Johnny McDonald is the guy who sort of showed me that this was a sunny place for shady people. I grew up reading murder mysteries. Everybody in my family reads murder mysteries. My grandfather was a big fan of Perry Mason. My mother loves Agatha Christie. And so one day my great aunt, who had noticed that I was reading, Philip Marlowe and Sam Spade books, took me to one side, took a big drag on her cigarette, her Pall Mall, and said, "I think you're ready for Travis McGee now." And handed me a copy of a book with a scantily clad woman on the cover. And I was 14 at the time, so I said, "Yes, ma'am, I believe I am ready for that." But what I didn't realize is that inside that sort of lurid cover was a story that was taking place in Florida, which blew my mind because all the mysteries I read were in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco. I had no idea that stuff like this could happen in Florida, and that usually the event that sets in motion everything is a development, somebody coming in wanting to make a fast buck on ruining the environment, and that blew my mind too because I was a Boy Scout. I was used to going camping by rivers, and my dad would take me hunting in the woods, and I realized this stuff I like is disappearing, and people are making money off of that. So John D. McDonald was a pretty big influence on me. There's also a piece in there about Elmore Leonard, who we think of as being a Michigan resident, a Detroit guy, but he was a part-time resident of Florida. And his biggest books, the ones that made him famous, were ones that were set in Florida. He also, and people don't really notice this, but in a lot of his Florida books, there are these characters who show up who are members of the Crow family. And they are classic Florida man types. They're always not quite as smart as they think they are. And they're always getting into trouble poaching alligators or moonshining or something like that. And in fact, there's at least one that shows up in books that gave us the character of Raylan Gibbons, who became famous from the TV show Justified. And then there's a piece about the most popular author you've never heard of, Donald J. Sobel, who wrote all the Encyclopedia Brown mysteries for kids. And what I love about Donald J. Sobel is that he was living in Miami in the 80s when he's writing a lot of these books. So he's surrounded by the whole cocaine cowboy era, where you'd see headlines like drug dealers masquerading as cops, arrested by cops masquerading as drug dealers. And so he'd read that in the morning paper, and then he'd go off and write another story about Encyclopedia Brown solving a bank robbery because he knows something about Civil War trivia. And then I cannot leave out one other Florida author, Charles Willeford, who is known as sort of the godfather of the wacky Florida crime novel. Willeford was a pulp expert. He wrote all kinds of books. He wrote memoirs, he wrote exploitive fiction, he wrote sex books. But in the early 80s, he wrote this book called Miami Blues that perfectly captures South Florida in the 80s in all of its weirdness. And then he wrote 3 sequels to that. And so one reader did not like one of the sequels, which was called Sideswipe, and actually sent it back to him in a box. It was a hardback copy, and in the box was the book, and with the book was a note in all caps that said, "It's a crime to charge this much for this kind of crap." And the thing about the book, as you can see, is that it had 6 bullet holes in it. And so the horrified friends said, "Well, are you going to call the cops? Have you notified the FBI?" And he said, No, I'm not going to call anybody because you know, I think it's good to get feedback. So I'm hoping you guys get better feedback than this on this. So I have some other wild Florida stories, and if you like this one, one is my last book, Cattail: The Wild Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther, which is now out in paperback. Which people told me, it came out just at the beginning of the pandemic, and which is, has been the death knell for a lot of books. But a lot of people told me it was a good pandemic read because it had a sort of a hopeful ending to it. Not a happy ending, but a hopeful ending. And then The Scent of Scandal, Breed, Betrayal, and the World's Most Beautiful Orchid, which is about how Selby Gardens in Sarasota wound up facing criminal charges because they got involved with orchid smuggling. And I always like to mention that book, as far as I know, is the only one ever classified, go ahead, as true crime / garden. I always feel bad for the bookstore clerks trying to get So, do you guys have any questions for me? I'm happy to answer.
Look at that orange.
No? Have I talked to y'all a lot? Yes, a woman I've never met before.
No, I've never seen this man in my life. This is a weird question, but did you?
I don't know how to handle it.
I know you. Am I the only human being that remembers Maximum Bob when it was on television?
No, I remember Maximum
Okay,
Bob.
I was going to ask you if you'd ever saw it. I thought it was one of the best Florida TV shows of
It's
all
a very good,
time.
and it's based on a real judge.
Yeah, I know.
And that's in the book. Maximum Bob was a TV show starring, was it Bo Bridges?
Yeah.
As this, I'm not sure if there's
Nutty
any way to explain,
judge.
horny judge in South Florida who, while committing various crimes himself, was known for issuing maximum sentences to miscreants.
And it was full of Florida men and women.
Yes, it was.
Very cool.
And the novel it was based on, there was actually an attack by alligator in that, and by one of the Crow members, one of the Crow family members. I think it was Elvin Crow.
Sorry.
It was based on a real judge, Maximum Morphonius, who was a female judge in I believe Broward County. And she was a classic Florida character. She had a pet monkey that wore diapers, and she kept it in her chambers. And she was very open about the fact that even though she was married, she had multiple boyfriends. And she wrote an autobiography called Maximum Morphonius. So that's where the Maximum Bob idea came from. Which, honestly, she sounds weirder than the fictional creation. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
What's next?
Good question. I have submitted a book proposal to my agent for a book about pythons. Which will be kind of a change of pace for me. I've written about manatees, I've written about panthers, and I've written about wetlands, all things that are native to Florida. So now this is my first book to write about invasive species and how they got here, and how we're dealing with it, which is badly, and some of the weird stuff that there's a python hunter I know who she actually apologizes to the python before shooting it in the head, and then she experiments with the meat. You're not supposed to eat the meat. Scientists say the meat is dangerous to you because too many of them have mercury in them from all the things they've eaten in the Everglades. But she says the smaller ones do not have that high level, and she tests it for mercury before cooking it up as her liver and onions recipe. She's also been known to use the eggs to make cookies.
That's
Yes.
gonna sell.
As a follow-up question to that one,
Yes.
have you ever thought of the possibility of, and would it be safe to write about legislators or politicians?
Well, I mean, there's certainly Ron Bergeron counts as a politician. He's here. And Florida had a whole section called the Tower of Power. It was about that and about the fact that we are graced with the most phallic state capital in the United States. There were no women on the design committee, I hasten to add. That's probably how that happened. Politics will play a part in the Python book also. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but our current governor has actually made one of his campaign promises to wipe out the pythons in the Everglades.
Good luck with that.
Which is pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
So I don't know how he's going to pull that off or how he's going to handle it in his re-election campaign.
It's demolition.
Yeah, there's it. That's it. He wants a civilian militia. Maybe he'll send a civilian militia out there to beat the bush. They can have whacking day every day. But the most of the most I've written about Florida politics and how crazy it is in the Tower of Power chapter. Florida.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
What's your favorite thing about Florida?
I mean, we've got, people sneer at us, people snicker about us, but we have world-class beaches routinely ranked in the top 10, if not number 1, by Dr. Beach, who chooses to live in Florida, I hasten to add. We've got these gorgeous cotton candy sunsets. I saw one just tonight. Cool beans. We've got an award-winning state park system. It's won national awards 4 times. No other state park system can make that claim. And we've got the most interesting police log items on a regular basis. I mean, weird stuff happens wherever you find humans, but more of it happens in Florida, and it does tend to be weirder. So I would not live anywhere else. I went to college in Alabama for 3 years and then got out of there as fast as I could.
From there.
I know. So I figure you owe them some allegiance via the SEC. Anyway, so that's. I mean, I open the news every day with anticipation.
So I have a question.
Yes.
I'm not a journalist by any means.
It's okay.
And but I'm just curious, like, how do you find your material, like the Alligator Man? Like, how did you find out that guy was who he is? And
Well, for 21 years, I covered environmental issues for the St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa Bay Times, and now I write a weekly column for the Florida Phoenix about environmental issues. So a lot of that just came up on my beat. Covering the environment in Florida is the best beat in American journalism. Number 1, because they have to pay you to go out and ride around a boat now and again. But number 2, because a lot of the weird stuff that happens in Florida involves the environment. Like pythons battling alligators in the Everglades, wildlife commissioner who wrestled an alligator, giant African land snails that got smuggled in by a religious cult that thought that drinking their mucus would make you healthy.
Stop it.
And actually had the opposite effect. Things like that. So, and also I have digital subscriptions to a lot of the state papers, and I also routinely check the subreddit called Florida Man, which posts wacky stuff, and one for FARC, which is a satirical website. They pick up stuff from Florida, put it on there too, and the Smoking Gun loves Florida too. That they'll post crazy arrests on there as well. And a lot of times you'll see something there, and then it'll get picked up by all the TV stations, or even by the Daily Mail in England, which loves a Florida Man. They had a field day with one out of Tampa from yesterday or day before, where some kids had gone to a trampoline park in Tampa, and a brawl broke out among the kids, and hundreds of them were fighting in the trampoline. So I guess they were like bouncing around, and the cops didn't arrest any of them. Not a one. They just let them bounce. Yes.
What about like COVID? I mean, Florida
thank you, I
is
don't
super weird about COVID, and it's not funny right now, but maybe
Well, it's a little.
it's a little weird.
There
But
was I put out
are you saving any nuggets
Well,
of
I put out a
funniness when it
weekly
will be
author-
funny?
I put out a weekly author newsletter called Florida, the newsletter, and you can sign up for that if you just give me your name and email address, by the way. And so recently in the newsletter, I pointed out that a group of anti-vaccine, pro-ivermectin doctors had held a national convention here in Ocala, and it was set up by an Ocala doctor who is of that ilk. And the Ocala doctor didn't realize the irony of having this convention at the World Equestrian Center.
Oh,
Until
yes,
the reporter
of
pointed
course,
it
yeah.
out to him. And then as a follow-up, 7 of the doctors went up contracting COVID. So
Yeah, well, I mean, I know it's not funny now,
It's
but
not
maybe,
funny, but
maybe some years from
it's
now it'll be funny.
in an ironic
Funny.
way.
Ironic,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's one of those.
Save it,
It's one of
save
those
it for the
fire
future.
things, yeah. When my kids were little, I taught them the word comeuppance. I said one of the most satisfying stories is the story of someone doing something bad or foolish, and then they get their comeuppance. And so they have learned, and they say, oh, he got his comeuppance. Did he? I said, yes. Anyone else? Yes. Woman I've never met before.
What advice would you give to someone who's thinking about moving to Florida?
Come on down and bring your money. And when you're here, always park in the shade.
Sweet.
If you get sand spurs, lick your fingers before you try to remove them, otherwise they'll stick you. And make sure you go to our state parks before you go to our theme parks.
Yeah,
Ah.
every day, state park.
But definitely bring your money. Because, I mean, I'm not the one who made this observation, but we are the Ponzi state. Our economy depends on getting lots more customers moving in every single day. And in fact, that's the stated reason for our podcast that we do every week, Welcome to Florida, which is 900 new people move to Florida every day, and nobody tells them what they've gotten themselves into. So we have guests on who can talk about different aspects of Florida, like rewilding your Florida yard, for instance, or we've had that python hunter who does the recipes. She was on there as a guest. Our most recent guest, his episode will drop next Tuesday, is Desmond Meade, the guy who lived in my room before. That was a really good one. We've got some serious ones. We got some not so serious ones. We had a guy on to talk about the history of Cuban sandwiches. We had a nudist on. He was not nude during the interview, or at least he said he wasn't. Hard to tell with radio. Check that out if you're into podcasts. Definitely check that out. We have fun. Occasionally we have sponsors too. So. Anyone else? Yes. One I've never met before.
You're a murder mystery fan. Do you have a contemporary murder mystery writer from Florida that you particularly like to work?
There's a woman named Steph Post who wrote a trilogy about a rural Florida ex-con and his girlfriend. The ex-con's name is Judy Cannon. I can't think of his girlfriend's name. And how he was fighting to get free of his family's criminal empire. And things just kept backfiring and pulling him back in deeper. And some of it's pretty serious. Some of it's really funny too. In the third book, there's actually an attempt to steal a racehorse from an Ocala stable that goes horribly awry. And there's a character who shows up in 2 of the books who is a doomsday prepper, but his hobby is gluing googly eyes on taxidermied squirrels. And so they have the scene where they go in to get guns from this guy, but then all the squirrels seem to be looking at him.
Is that book fiction or nonfiction?
She says it's fiction, but
does that with squirrels?
yeah, she says it's fiction, but she lives up in Hernando County. Who knows? And her husband's a firefighter, so he probably sees stuff. And of course, I read everything Tim Dorsey writes, and Carl Hyacin, his most recent book, was one of the funniest.
Oh, wasn't it fabulous?
What
was the title?
Squeeze Me.
Squeeze me.
Squeeze me,
Yes.
So good.
Yes, it was. And I'll be noting that in my new book. So yeah, and there are other folks. There's a guy named Tom Corcoran who writes mysteries that are set in Key West and have a really strong sense of place. You can tell Tom lived there for a long time, and he actually was Jimmy Buffett's photographer on tour. So In fact, he says he bought Jimmy his first beer in Cuba.
Everybody says.
Yeah.
That's what Jimmy said, right?
Yeah, probably. All right, is that it? Did I talk y'all all out?
Thank you guys so much for coming and spending some time with us. As you stated, he was our first author event
Yes.
when we first opened, so
Oh,
we're so glad to
wow.
have him back.
Yeah.
And you can get a copy of the State You're In at the register.
Yep,
Thank
I'm
you.
a bad penny. They can't get rid of me. I keep coming back.
We want you back. It's great.
Yeah, every time.
Where do you want me to sign if I'm doing personal information?
Let's make you back here. Yeah.
And before, I invited
Came here, he wanted to buy.
How are you?
You're immortalized in my memory. I'm on the Q and Steve
Yeah. Been good.
I got Bill Oderson to draw me some
Okay,
tiles. And so I didn't tell him what to draw or anything, but I said draw some shared experiences, you know, like singles, like we worked at the Flambeau.
Okay, Karen, all right, thanks. Yeah, well, we're thinking about going somewhere to eat.
So he did a two.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you came out.
Walking during the day. It is, you're right.
Yeah.
Good leaders.
Well, you take care.
You want me to buy one?